Hello, you are most welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to today's tutorial. Today, we want to begin our journey looking at arterial blood supply to the upper limb. Now, remember that some of the branches that I will be making mention of, yes, will supply some portions of the thorax. Yes, mainly is going to be the intercostal, arteries, which I'll be mentioning of. The anterior intercostal, posterior intercostal. I'll be making mention of some of these ones, which will supply the various structures in the intercostal spaces. But I'm interested in actually the upper limb. So remember that in the upper limb, yes, mainly coming from the aortic arch, which I'm going to show you, yes, we will actually begin as what we call either straightforward as the left subclavian artery or as a branch from what we call the brachiocephalic trunk. So you have this artery known as the subclavian artery, mainly because it's below the clavicle, subclavian artery. And remember that the subclavian artery will be behind its corresponding vein, being the subclavian vein. Now, this subclavian artery, yes, from its origin up to the external border or the outer border of the first rib, okay, becomes, so continuing from the outer border of the first rib downwards, becomes the axillary artery, which is related to the axilla, that's the armpit. So it's the same artery, which we are giving it a different name depending on the location that it is found. Then beyond that, yes, when we get to the brachium or the arm, we will now call it what we call the brachial artery. And then it will also divide into what we call the, in the forearm, it will divide into the radial, as well as the ulnar arteries. And they will eventually, supply that of the, the hand. They will supply that of the hand, giving that of the deep as well as the superficial palmar arches. So we will actually go through the journey, but to start with, we will actually begin with that of the subclavian artery. So let me just show you this now. So this is the aorta. Okay, I'll actually go through the heart with you so that we can actually see. Now this is actually the largest artery in the human body, the aorta, an elastic artery. Now look at this. The aorta, will have three main branches in the thorax. It is going to have what we call the ascending branch. Okay, the ascending branch will be here. Now this ascending branch will give off these arteries, being the right and left coronary arteries, to supply the muscles of the heart itself. Then it arches around T4 vertebral level. It arches so that it gives us three main branches. And so from right to left, the BSC, muscles or BCS muscles, we are going to have arteries. We are going to have what we call the brachiocephalic trunk. Okay, brachiocephalic trunk. And then we're going to have what we call the left common carotid artery. And then to the extreme left, we are going to have what we call the left subclavian artery. Now remember that the brachiocephalic trunk will then divide, bifurcate, to give us what we call the right, common carotid artery. Okay, so remember that the common carotids will always be in the middle. And then it will also give rise to the right subclavian artery. So this is how normally we expect it to be. Now the arch of aorta will then continue as a descending thoracic aorta, which will of course give off some branches. So now there could be some variation. Okay, so anatomical variations are very common, such that on the arch of aorta, instead of having three branches, brachiocephalic, yes, left common carotid and left subclavian artery, it will actually have just two branches. And these two branches will have what we call the brachiocephalic trunk, and then of course the left subclavian artery. So with the left subclavian artery, almost always it will be constant, okay, but a common carotid artery, both left and right, who actually originates from what we call the brachiocephalic trunk. So this one becoming the right common carotid, and this one becoming the left common carotid. And then of course the right subclavian artery will also emerge. So these are some kind of variations which can actually take place. So now, as we said, this is the artery. Okay, this is the artery, and the artery, now remember that this artery being the subclavian artery, remember that we are having the left subclavian artery. Now remember that the left subclavian artery actually originated directly from, so the left subclavian artery actually originated directly from what we call the arch of aorta. Okay, normally. and then that of the right will actually originate from what we call branch of what we call the brachiocephalic trunk. So it tells us that yes, the left subclavian artery will actually originate, okay, from what we call the superior mediastinum, with the left subclavian artery actually originating above the superior mediastinum, just behind what we call the sternoclavicular joint, behind the sternoclavicular joint. That is where it is going to actually originate. But remember that yes, this is the main artery which is going to give oxygenated blood or oxygen-rich blood to the arm, as well as giving some branches to the thoracic region. Now this artery, yes, you can see that it courses laterally. Okay, it moves laterally this way. Now as it moves, now what happens is that it's going to give off some branches. Now this artery, with the help of this important muscle being the scalenus anterior muscle, this scalenus anterior muscle will actually insert. Now there's the first rib. The first rib bears what we call scalene tubercle, so it inserts on the scalene tubercle of the first rib. Okay, so that we can actually divide this artery into three parts. We have the first part being the proximal part. Okay, we will have what we call the deep part, okay, the one with behind it, the subclavian artery, and we have also the dorsal part or the lateral part. So what happens is that yes, this artery will travel laterally towards the armpit area, the axillary area. Now look at this. This is the first rib. Now beyond this first rib, now this is the lateral border of the first, or the outer border. This is the medial border or the internal border. Now the outer border, beyond the outer border of the first rib, okay, we now call it the axillary artery. So let me say that yeah, the axillary artery is a continuation of the subclavian artery beyond the outer border of the first rib. Okay, beyond the outer border of the first rib. So that is one thing that we have to know. Now look at this. Now this is the first part. So it means that the first part will actually from the origin, okay, it could be from the brachiocephalic trunk, that's if the right subclavian artery, or the arch of aorta if it's the left subclavian artery. Okay, from its origin all the way to the medial border. Okay, this is the outer border of the scalenus anterior muscle, and this is the medial border of the scalenus anterior muscle. Okay, this will be the extent of what we call the first part. And then the second part will be from, of course, the medial border up to the outer border of the subclavian artery. And then, of course, the third part will be from the outer border of the subclavian artery to the lateral border of the first rib. Okay, lateral. Okay, that's the distal part. Okay, so these are how we are going to have it. Now the first part, normally I'm going to go through the normal anatomy with you, but sometimes I'm making mention of the variation which may actually take place. Now the first part is going to have three main branches. Okay, the first part is going to have three main branches. The second part will have a branch, and of course the third part will also have a branch. But sometimes, yes, that third part may not be present, but I'm going through the normal anatomy with you. So as we move on, we will actually see all those branches. But let me just run through, just have an overview of those branches. Now the first part will give us, the three main branches being the VIT branches. Okay, so we can say vitamin, vitamin. So the first VIT of vitamin will be the branches of the first part of the subclavian artery. So V for vertebral artery, I for internal thoracic artery or the internal mammary artery, and then T for what we call thyrocervical trunk. Okay, thyrocervical trunk. And then of course the thyrocervical trunk will also give us some branches, which I use the mnemonic SIT. And SIT will be actually for what we call the suprascapular artery, I for what we call the inferior thyroid artery. Okay, so let's look at that one, inferior thyroid. Okay, this one is the inferior thyroid artery. Now remember that the inferior thyroid artery could give a branch of which we call the ascending cervical artery. Okay, this is the inferior thyroid artery, and it may give this branch which is the ascending cervical artery. But remember, this ascending cervical artery could actually become a direct branch from what we call the first part of the subclavian artery. and then the T will be what we call the transverse cervical artery, which of course we also call it the superficial cervical artery. So these are, the main structures which will be coming from the first part. Okay, we also look at, the various branches as we run through these ones. Okay, so without much ado, yes, let's quickly move on and then see it. So again, let's just go through it again. Here is the first part of the subclavian artery. Okay, the second part is deep to, the scalenus anterior muscle, and then the third part, the distal part or the lateral part. Okay, so the first part, as we've already seen, will give rise, moving superiorly, going through, the upper 6 transverse foramina will be the vertebral artery, and then we also have, below that one, or let me say, yes, below, that one, going downwards into the thoracic region will be the internal mammary artery or the internal thoracic artery, and then just opposite but superior to it, to the internal mammary artery, will be what we call the thyroid cervical trunk. We said that the thyroid cervical trunk will give off these branches, which are the 6 branches, and that's the suprascapular artery, inferior thyroid, inferior thyroid artery, as you can see, coursing this way, which will give rise to, of course, the ascending cervical. And then we also have what we call the transverse cervical artery. Transverse cervical artery. Transverse cervical artery may also give rise to, divide into the deep branch and, of course, a superficial branch. So we actually go through all these, dynamics. So, we've seen that the subclavian artery is going to have 3 parts. Now, the first part, which is proximal, the proximal part, or that is the medial part, yes, is going to have 3 main branches, and these 3 main branches are those ones that I want to go through with you. So one of them is the vertebral artery. So you can see that there's the arch of aorta, aortic arch, and then we have the left subclavian artery arising directly from it, and we can see that, yes, this would therefore be the first part of the subclavian artery, giving off this branch, which we call it vertebral artery. So remember that the vertebral artery ascends upwards, going through the upper 6 cervical vertebrae. So look at this. Now this is C7, the 7th cervical vertebra. But surprisingly, it doesn't go through the 7th cervical vertebra. Yeah, the reason is that the 7th cervical vertebra does not have what we call transverse foramina. Now, even if it has, they will be so miniature, in nature, such that, yes, these, arteries cannot traverse through them, so that is one thing that, we have to see. Now, as it goes through, upwards, eventually, the left and right part will actually meet to form what we call the basilar artery. So when I actually explain what we call the circle of Louis, I'll go through that kind of, blood supply. I'll go through that kind of blood supply to the brain. We actually make mention of the vertebral artery once again. But, as they come in anastomose to form the basilar artery, what happens is that, both left and right part of the vertebral artery will give rise to this branch, being the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So we actually, go through all these ones. So, that is that. But one thing that I want you to know is that depending on which part that we have, where the vertebral artery has reached, we will actually have 4 parts of the vertebral artery. You have 4 parts, and these parts have been designated V1. So that was the first part of the vertebral artery. So this first part of vertebral artery, now you can see that this first part hasn't reached or hasn't gone through these transverse foramina, and therefore we also call them prevertebral artery, or we also call it preforaminal, because they've not gone through the foramina of the transverse processes. So preforaminal artery. So this is the preforaminal artery of the vertebral artery. Now this is actually an anterior view of it, because you can see that the bodies of the upper 6 together with some of the first 2 thoracic vertebrae. So this is the vertebral or preforaminal part of the vertebral artery. Now you can see that it ascends upwards and then go through these foramina to become the second part. Okay, to become the second part. Now I will show you that this first part will actually run actually anterior to what we call the stellate ganglion, or that's the inferior cervical ganglion, which because of its position, because it's more closer to the thoracic region as well as the cervical region, more or less like a transitional point, we also call it cervical thoracic ganglion. So we actually I'll actually show you that one. But apart from that, what happens is that yes, it will actually run lateral to what we call the it will actually run lateral to what we call the longus coeli muscle. Longus coeli muscle. Apart from that, it will be medial to what we call the scalenus anterior muscle. So I'll actually show you all these structures, which now, so it is very clear that the second part is the foraminal part, or the vertebral part proper. And then of course it's going to go through actually the C6 up to C3 transverse foramina. Now what happens is that they will actually be anterior to what we call the associated spinal nerves. So the spinal nerve over here, the spinal nerve over here, so they will actually be running anterior to the adjoining or associated spinal nerves. And in here it may also give off some branches, some smaller branches to supply the various structures around this area. So that is what we are going to have. Now the third part, now because the third part is more related to the atlas and axis, and of course atlas comes before axis. Atlas is C1 and axis is C2. Then we also call it the atlantic part. So there's the atlantic part of the vertebral artery. So what happens is that the atlantic part actually course behind, but actually laterally, or let me say to course medially behind what we call the lateral masses. So we have the lateral masses of what we call the atlas. You have run medially in that manner. And what happens is that yes, it's able to enter what we call the vertebral canal. It will enter the vertebral canal to actually run deep to what we call the occipital membrane. So I'll actually explain what we call the occipital membrane to you. I'll actually show you that one. And then of course when that happens, it becomes a content of what we call the posterior suboccipital triangle actually. Now what will happen is that yes, the fourth part it has actually entered the cranial cavity, so to speak. So we call it the intracranial part. Now this intracranial part, yes, because it has entered the cranial cavity, it will actually pierce into what we call the dura mater, that was the Pachymeninx, and then also go through what we call one of the leptomeninges, being what we call the arachnoid matter, to enter what we call the subarachnoid space. And then you can see that over there what will happen is that the left and right parts will actually anastomose to form what we call the basilar artery, which we've seen. So there we are. This is the first part of the vertebral artery. So if we take a section, and I said it will be running superficial to the stellate ganglion or the inferior cervical ganglion, and then running on its lateral to it will be the scalenus anterior muscle. And this scalenus anterior muscle is therefore dividing this subclavian artery into the proximal part, into the deep part, and of course the dorsal part. So it will be running lateral to the scalenus anterior muscle, but medial to the longus coeli muscle. So that's what the relations that we have to actually appreciate regarding the first part of the vertebral artery. Then here we have actually the vertebral artery. We're going to have the second part over here, and I told that the third part will actually pierce into what we call the atlanto-occipital membrane to run deep to it, and then becoming a content of the suboccipital triangle. So I mean, that is what we have to actually appreciate regarding the parts of the vertebral artery. So having seen the vertebral artery being one of the branches of the first part of the subclavian artery, the next part is the internal thoracic artery or the internal mammary artery. Now this internal mammary artery, you can see that it descends downwards, okay, unlike the vertebral artery which ascends upwards. This internal thoracic artery descends downwards, actually running almost parallel, okay, to each other. Okay, we have two of them running parallel to each other, but actually running deep to what we call the costal cartilages. So that is what mainly we have to actually see. Now this internal thoracic artery will have some important branches. Now importantly, it will give off these branches which we call them anterior intercostal branches. Now remember that we have 9 anterior intercostal arteries, 9 anterior intercostal arteries, but we're going to have you see that we have 11 posterior intercostal arteries. Now these 9 anterior intercostal arteries, now the upper 6, okay, so the first 6, so this was the first intercostal space, one of them will come here, second, third, fourth, and sixth. So the upper 6 intercostal arteries, okay, so sorry, these intercostal arteries will be running in the lower border. So there's the first one, second, third, fourth, fifth, and then sixth. So the upper 6 intercostal arteries will actually be coming directly from what we call the internal thoracic artery. So there will be branches, okay, of the internal thoracic artery giving supply to the upper 6 intercostal spaces and structures. So that is one of the branches that we will see coming from the internal mammary artery or the internal thoracic artery. Now other branches that we are going to see will be what we call the musculophrenic artery. Now remember, now the word is musculophrenic, so it means that it has something to do with the diaphragm, but essentially it is going to give rise to what we call the lower 3 intercostal arteries. So the upper 6 coming directly from the internal thoracic artery, the lower 3 will be coming from what we call the musculophrenic artery, which is a branch of internal mammary artery. Okay, internal mammary artery. So that is one thing that you have to know regarding these ones. Now apart from that, yes, we also have what we call the superior epigastric artery. So, epigastric means that it's going to supply some areas in the abdominal area, of course above the stomach. Epi means above, and then of course gastric has to do with the stomach. But what happens is that these epigastric vessels will actually run in what we call the rectus sheath, okay, of the anterior abdominal wall, to actually supply the rectus muscles up to the level of the umbilicus, okay, up to the level of the belly button. So you have to know the extent to which this superior epigastric artery will be supplying the rectus abdominis muscle. So that is one thing that you have to know. Well, apart from these main branches that we are going to find with the internal mammary artery, yes, we also give some branches like the pericardiophrenetic artery to supply, of course, the pericardium, as well as some portion of the diaphragm. Then of course may also give off some mediastinal branches to supply some structures in the superior mediastinum. Okay, so it means those structures will come directly somewhere here, okay, so to supply some areas in the superior mediastinum. So mainly the thymus in developing individual, you are going to find these ones there. Okay, so that is one thing that we have to know. But remember that we are calling it internal mammary artery. So it means that yes, it can give some branches to supply the mammary glands as well. Now, so still with the branches that we are looking at, yes, the other branch that you find over here, the other branch that we find over here is known as a thyrocervical trunk. Now you can see this place is a bit darkened, showing you where the scalenus anterior muscle is, and therefore it means that this artery is actually deep to the scalenus anterior muscle. I'll actually come to that one. So this is the thyrocervical trunk. Thyrocervical trunk. I've already indicated that the thyrocervical trunk, using the mnemonic structures or six arteries. Yes, that would be the suprascapular artery. We also have, the inferior, thyroid artery, which also give off some branch, the ascending cervical artery, and then mainly the transverse or the superficial cervical artery will be coming from it. So that is what I'm going to go through with you. So, there we are. You can see this. Here we have the inferior thyroid artery. Okay, so the inferior thyroid artery, yes, this artery will actually supply, give some supply to some portion of, the thyroid gland, actually the posterior inferior portion of the thyroid gland. But not only that, yes, it also, although the name is inferior thyroid artery, yes, it also give us, it also gives some supply to what we call the, the parathyroid gland. Even apart from that, some bits to the esophagus, apart from that, even the pharynx, as well as, of course, the larynx. So it will give off some few branches to supply these areas as well. But one thing that we have to know regarding the inferior thyroid artery is that, yes, it will actually ascend at the level of the cricoid cartilage. Okay, there's a cricoid cartilage. It begins to ascend a bit, so just ascending small, then it begins, then it courses medially. It courses medially, actually behind what we call the carotid sheath. Now remember that the carotid sheath will have the common carotid artery as content. Apart from that, yes, internal carotid artery, internal carotid artery. Apart from that, even the vagus nerve will be content of the carotid sheath. But they will actually, this artery will actually course behind the carotid sheath, and of course these structures which are content will also be running anterior to what we call the inferior thyroid artery. So what will happen is that, as it moves and gets closer to the thyroid area, that's where the thyroid gland is, it will be moving, alongside what we call the recurrent laryngeal, nerve. Now remember that the recurrent laryngeal nerve, actually courses under the left subclavian, artery. Okay, so it will be moving intimately with what we call the recurrent laryngeal nerve. So, that is what, we are going to actually see. Okay, that's what we are actually going to see. I told you that this inferior thyroid artery may give rise to what we call the ascending cervical artery. So these are, that's kind of dynamics. But remember that the ascending cervical artery that we saw could actually be coming from what we call the thyrocervical trunk directly. Now we've seen that. Now over here you see that the right and left superior and of course inferior thyroid artery will actually anastomose, okay, inside the substance of the gland, okay, to give off some supply to it. So that is what we are actually going to actually see. Now the next artery, which is part of what we call the the thyrocervical trunk, which is a branch of what we call the first part of the subclavian artery. We are also going to see what we call the transverse cervical artery, transverse cervical artery. So as the name suggests, yes, it's going to run transversely across the neck area. Okay, transverse cervical artery. The word cervical or cervix has to do with the neck, so it will run posterolaterally, okay, after coursing in front of what we call the scalenus anterior muscle. So the scalenus anterior muscle will be here, but it will run in front of the scalenus anterior muscle. So it means the scalenus anterior muscle will be deep to what we call the transverse cervical artery. It won't run behind, it will run anterior to what we call the scalenus anterior muscle. But what happens is that, yes, apart from even running anterior to it, it will also run anterior to what we call the phrenic nerve as well. Okay, so phrenic nerve, when we take a closer look at the diaphragm, it's, we also mentioned the phrenic nerve once again. Although I've done a video on that, you can also visit that one. okay, for some kind of insight. That's phrenic nerve will actually be running deep, will actually be running, yes, behind what we call the transverse cervical artery. Then apart from that, it will also be running anterior to what we call the brachial plexus. Now you know that brachial plexus will be running in between the the anterior scalene and of course middle scalene muscles. Okay, so it will also be running anterior to these structures as well. Now in so doing, it will give off some branches to supply these nerves, okay, blood vessels to these nerves, and that is what we call the vasa nervorum of it will supply the vasa nervorum of what we call the brachial plexus. Apart from that, it will also give off some branches, okay, to what we call, to supply the trapezius muscle, which are the superficial muscles of the back. Apart from the levator scapulae, the rhomboideus major and minor, as well as even the latissimus dorsi. So that is how you see it. That's how you see it. But what happens is that, yes, at the anterior border of the levator, scapulae. So actually, the levator scapulae will be running somewhere this way. So this is the scapula, okay, and this is the spine of the scapula. Now above the spine of the scapula, okay, at the posterior aspect of what we call the medial border, okay, we will having this insertion of what we call the levator scapulae. So at actually the anterior border of what we call the levator scapulae, what will happen is that it will bifurcate, okay, to give what we call a deep branch and of course a superficial branch, okay, to give a deep branch and then a superficial branch. As you can see over here, this is going to be the superficial branch, and then we also have the deep branch. Now the deep branch is what usually we call it as what we call the dorsal scapular artery. Okay, so this is the artery, dorsal scapular artery, and this is a superficial branch. So that is what we are going to see regarding the transverse cervical artery. Now remember, this dorsal scapular artery could be coming directly, okay, from what we call the third part of the subclavian artery. So we actually go through that one to see. Now the other artery, yes, although somewhat runs a bit parallel to it, but actually runs inferior to what we call the transverse cervical artery, is the suprascapular artery. So you can see that it's running on top of the scapula, so we call it suprascapular artery. Now this suprascapular artery, yes, will actually approach the scapula, okay, to meet a nerve. Okay, so I'm going to show you the suprascapular nerve. Now remember, this is very important for you to actually know the relations between what we call, or the relationship between what we call the suprascapular artery, okay, or the suprascapular vessels, as well as of course suprascapular nerve. So artery for above and nerve for below. Now as they meet over here around the scapular area, actually, now this is what we call the medial border. This is the lateral border, and we have what we call the superior border. Now the superior border, there's a notch, okay, this is the coracoid process of the scapula. So there's a notch over there known as the suprascapular notch, and this notch is formed when what we call the transverse scapular nerve spans between where we have the superior border up to where we have the coracoid process. So there will be a notch over there, small opening over there. Now this notch, will house what we call the suprascapular nerve, the dark structure. So you see the dark structure running deep over here, okay, will be the suprascapular nerve. But running above what we call the notch, okay, or running above the transverse scapular ligament, will be what we call the suprascapular artery, as well as the vein. Artery for above, so it will run above the suprascapular notch. But at the end of the day, they will run, okay, now there's a glenoid cavity, okay, there's the spine of the scapula, so there's also a notch over here, which we call it the spinoglenoidal notch. Okay, so this spinoglenoidal notch will actually be, housing, or will be providing, accommodation, okay, or transit point for both the suprascapular, nerve and vessels. So unlike the, suprascapular notch, which in the content you have only suprascapular nerve, but running above it will be the suprascapular vessels. In the spinoglenoidal notch, we are going to have both the vessels as well as the nerve being content of it, and of course supplying, of course, the suprascapular, muscles. So that is one thing that you have to know. You have to actually know the relationship between the suprascapular artery and nerve with respect to what we call the suprascapular notch, as well as the glenoidal, the glenoidal spinal notch, or the spinoglenoidal notch. So that is one thing that you have to know. Now, so we are done with the first part of the subclavian artery, and the first part, yes, we've seen that, yes, we are going to have the VIT structures, the vertebral artery. We also seen the internal thoracic artery, and of course we've also seen that of the thyroid cervical trunk, given of all these branches that we've gone through. Now the second part, which is deep to what we call the subclavian artery, will give rise to this branch, which we call the costal cervical trunk. Now this costal cervical trunk, yes, will run actually posteriorly, okay, will run posteriorly, over what we call the cervical pleura, okay, cervical pleura. So if you look at the lung, I've done the lung. If you can go and look at the lung anatomy, you actually see the cervical pleura. So it will actually run posterior to what we call the cervical pleura, actually over the cervical pleura, and it will get towards where we have the first rib. Okay, this is where the first rib is. There's rib 1. So at the first rib, then what will happen is that it will divide into what we call a superior portion, okay, which we call it the deep cervical artery, and an inferior portion, which we call it the supreme, or the highest, or the superior intercostal artery. Now I'll come to this one. Now what will happen is that this superior branch, which you call the deep cervical artery, or the profunda, artery of the neck region, okay, this is the artery. This artery, yes, will run deep, okay, in the neck region to actually give supply to what we call the main structures, deep structures in the neck region, mainly semispinalis muscle, as well as of course the semicervicis, okay, semicervicis capitis, as well as semispinalis, okay, semispinalis capitis, as well as semispinalis cervicis. Okay, so one is more to the the head area, so that's why we call it capitis, and then the one which is related more to the neck area, that's the cervicis, so supplying these muscles. But one thing that you have to know is that as this muscle runs, it will be coursing between what we call the rib 1, the neck of rib 1, okay, as well as the transverse process of C7. Okay, so it will be running between these ones. So as you can see, the neck of rib 1 will be here, and then to be running between these ones, as well as the transverse process of the C7, the 7th cervical vertebra. Now for the inferior division, which we are calling it the highest, or the supreme, or the superior intercostal artery, yes, will give off the first two, will divide to supply the first two posterior intercostal spaces. Now remember, for the posterior intercostal spaces, we are going to have 11 posterior intercostal spaces. So the first two spaces, okay, will be getting the supply from what we call the the highest, will be branches from highest intercostal artery. But remember that the remaining 9 will be coming directly from what we call the descending thoracic aorta, thoracic aorta. So remember, look at all these dynamics, and so that you can actually appreciate these ones. Now I want to actually show you these ones. Now look at this. There's a rib. Okay, so there's the vertebrae. So from the vertebrae, I mean, we're going to have the ribs actually having that kind of attachment to them. Okay, so I've actually looked at the osteology of, that of the thorax, the thoracic cage. I mean the bones over there, the ribs, the thoracic vertebrae. I've done all these things, so you can visit those videos. Okay, I mean, you can see there's the sternum. I've done all these ones. So I'm actually trying to show you this how the ribs goes. Now what we are saying is that we are going to have what we call anterior. Okay, we are going to have what we call anterior intercostal artery, and then we will have what we call posterior intercostal arteries as well. Anterior intercostal arteries, okay, we are going to have what we call 9 of them. Posterior intercostal arteries, we are going to have 11. Okay, please appreciate these ones. For the anterior intercostal arteries, yes, we've seen that the first 6 will be coming, directly from what we call internal mammary artery. Then the lower 3 will be coming from, the musculophrenic artery. Now for the posterior will be coming, okay, the upper 2 will be coming from the supreme, okay, intercostal artery, or the highest intercostal artery, which is actually a branch, okay, the inferior branch of, what we call the costo-cervical trunk. The remaining lower 3, the inferior 9 will be coming from what we call directly from the aorta, okay, the descending thoracic aorta, direct branch. So that's what I want you to know. Now remember that in between rib can also be called a costal bone. So in between any 2 ribs, we're going to have an intercostal space. And this intercostal space, yes, we are going to have what we call intercostal muscles. For the intercostal muscles, I'll come to them later on, but we are going to have what we call external intercostal, internal intercostal, and innermost intercostal muscles. Now in between the internal intercostal muscle and of course innermost intercostal muscle, we are going to have the neurovascular bundles, okay, running there. And these neurovascular bundles, with a mnemonic VAN, you can know the positions. So the superiormost structure is the intercostal vein, followed by the intercostal artery, and then intercostal nerve. So VAN, vein, artery, nerve, in that manner. But remember that these structures will run through what we call the costal groove. So that's one thing that you have to actually appreciate over here. So that's what I want you to know. But remember, the anterior intercostal artery and of course posterior intercostal artery will actually anastomose, okay, around this area to form a very rich supply, giving it to the thoracic area. So now the third part of the subclavian artery, okay, or the lateral part or the distal part, is known as the dorsal scapular artery. The dorsal scapular artery. Okay, the dorsal scapular artery. It's going to be here. So yes, we are going to have the dorsal scapular artery. Okay, the dorsal scapular artery, although not really shown over here, but we are going to have it over here. It's going to actually run with the dorsal scapular nerve. So that's where the dorsal scapular artery. Now the reason why we are having this transverse cervical artery is that yes, it's going to have a rich anastomosis with it, so that it will actually supply these muscles that we find over here. But just to talk about this dorsal scapular artery, although I've told you that we've seen it already, which we said that it could be coming directly from what we call the deep branch of the transverse cervical artery. Okay, so if it's coming from that one, then it will be running along the what we call medial border, okay, of the scapula in this manner. But running alongside with it will be what we call the transverse cervical artery, or the transverse artery of the neck region. Okay, so that is what you have to actually know. Now this, okay, you can see running alongside with it will be the dorsal scapular nerve, okay, to actually give the supply to what we call the structures which are going to originate from the posterior aspect of the medial border of the scapula. And these structures are the levator scapulae, the rhomboideus minor, which originate at the origin of the spine of the scapula, and then below that we are going to have the rhomboideus major muscle. Okay, so that is what we have now. So what I'm trying to say is that yes, this transverse cervical artery, yes, will actually give rise to the dorsal scapular artery, or this transverse cervical artery will be running alongside what we call the dorsal scapular artery to supply these structures. So these are the variations, the dynamics that we can see. Okay, these are the dynamics that we can see. Now what happens is that yes, because of its position, the dorsal scapular artery, yes, is often described as the last or the final collateral branch of the subclavian axis. Okay, so that's one thing too that we have to know. So mainly that is what we have to actually appreciate regarding these branches coming from what we call the the subclavian artery, and for that matter over here the third part of the subclavian artery. So remember, the third part, yes, it may not give any branch, and for that matter that branch could be coming directly from the transverse cervical artery or the superficial cervical artery. Now remember again that yes, over here we've seen it already. Okay, these are what we call the suprascapular artery, and then also have what we call the suprascapular nerve. So we can see the transverse scapular nerve, and running below it will be the the suprascapular nerve, and then the suprascapular artery will be running above the suprascapular suprascapular notch. So that is one thing, but both of them will be content of the spinal-glenoidal notch, as we can see over here. So these are the things that we've seen already. We've gone through all these branches of we've seen some of the causes of these structures, of these vessels, or the branches which are coming from the subclavian artery. I hope you find it helpful, and in our future discussions or tutorials we'll actually be looking at that of the axillary artery, and then later we look at the brachial artery, and the other arteries will actually follow. So thank you very much for your audience.